Okay, guys, it's Mr. Cannon here again, and we're going to be covering Lesson 4 in Government today. And our lesson today is on federalism. Federalism is a concept that's a hallmark of our Constitution. It's a hallmark of our type of government. So people get separation of powers and federalism confused. And I'm urging you not to do that, okay? The two things are different. Separation of powers refers to the separating of power at the federal level between the three branches of government. Federalism deals with levels of government. So let's look at this a little bit further. Okay, so what federalism is the sharing of power between the federal, state, and local governments. So you have three levels of government. Think of it like a pyramid. At the top level, you've got the federal government. That's represented by the president, the Congress, the Supreme Court. Those are representative of our federal government. And then you have state governments. State governments are represented by the different states. In our state, South Carolina, we have a governor, we have a state legislature at the state house, and that's representative of our government here in South Carolina. And then we have lots of local governments as well. Lexington County is an example of a local government. Columbia would be an example of a local government. These are county governments, city governments, municipalities, things like that. And so in our system, we have a shared system where the federal government has some power, the state government has some power, the local governments have some power, and then there are some powers that we call concurrent, or they're shared between the levels of government. An example is taxes, for instance. The federal government can tax, the states and the local government can tax. So those are shared powers. All right, so we'll look at this a little bit further as we move forward. All right, before we get into what a federal system actually looks like, let's get into the why we have a federal system. There are three main types of systems. You have a unitary system, a confederal system, and a federal system. Early in our history, we had a confederal system under the Articles of Confederation. And as we discussed in another lesson, that didn't work. The Articles of Confederation were too weak. Basically, what a confederal system is, it's a loose alliance of states where powers are given to the federal government, but the states really have their own thing going on. The states control themselves, and they are over the federal government. They only give the central government or the federal government a small amount of power. And that's what we had under the Articles of Confederation. There are benefits to that. A benefit of a confederal system is that you won't have an abusive central government. The states give more power to the people, so that's an advantage. A disadvantage of a confederal system is that, as we saw in the Articles of Confederation, you can often have chaos. We had Shays' Rebellion, and it was very difficult to put that rebellion down because the central government didn't have enough power. Under a unitary system, it's sort of the opposite of that. A unitary system is where you have a very strong central government and weaker states. An advantage to that unitary system is that you can have more control over the laws, you can have more order in a society. A disadvantage is that there's less power to the people, and the government can become abusive and rule over the people. So these two types of systems are the extremes. So what we did is we split the difference, so to speak, and we have what's called a federal system, where you do have a federal government, a stronger central government, but it doesn't have all the power. It shares power with the states. And you can see there in the image what those three different ones look like. Under a unitary system, the top level of government, everything rolls down from it. It controls everything, and it gives just a little bit of power to the states. Under a confederal system, everything rolls up from the states to the federal government, and the federal government has very little power. Under our system, it's shared. So you have the states giving some power to the federal government gives some power to the states, and some of it shared between both of them. All right, so let's talk about types of power in the federal government. Okay, so there are three different types of power within our federal government in the Constitution. You have what are called delegated powers, or these are specific powers, in other words, given to the federal government. They are delegated. They are specifically given to the government. There is no question about it. It's written in the Constitution, like coining money or declaring war. Those are specific powers given to our federal government in the Constitution. No one questions those powers. They are very clearly laid out. But there are only a handful of delegated powers. And so then we get to the next level of power, which we're called implied powers. Implied powers are not specifically listed in the Constitution, but they can be implied based on the delegated powers given. So for an example, we know that the federal government has a specific power to declare war. The federal government gets to declare war. That is listed in the Constitution. From that, an implied power could be drafting an army. Okay, so because the federal government has the ability to declare war, they imply that they also have the ability to raise an army through a draft system. Now, we don't have a draft system anymore. It's all voluntary, but we have had one in the past. And people may question, how can the federal government do that? It's not listed in the Constitution. They do it through what is called implied powers. Because they have the power to make war, they necessarily should have, or imply that they should have the power to raise an army. Taxes would be another example. They have the power to coin money, so therefore they have the power to raise taxes. Inherent powers is the third level of power that the federal government has. These are powers that aren't listed in the Constitution, and they're not even implied, but they're simply powers that the government has because it is a government. For instance, making territorial lines, drawing boundaries, is something that is an inherent power of the federal government, of the government. Every government everywhere has been able to draw boundaries for itself and to say this is where our country begins and this is where it ends. And that's an inherent power that we have because we are a government. Every government has those. So delegated, implied, and inherent powers are the three types of power that we see from our federal government. The most controversial of these, by the way, is the implied powers. Those are the ones that we have debate about. Do the federal government really have that power or not? And sometimes the courts have to intervene to decide that. Okay, let's talk about the sharing of power between the federal, state, and local governments. Now, the federal government, certain powers definitely belong to it. We've talked about those in a previous slide. Things like declaring war, coining money, those are things that only the federal government can do. States can't decide they're going to make their own money. States can't decide they're going to declare war. They can't do that. That's not a power given to them. That's a power only given to the federal government. Making treaties is another example. South Carolina can't decide it's going to make a treaty with Japan that's different from a treaty that North Carolina makes. That doesn't happen. Only the federal government, representing our entire country, can make a treaty. So those are specific to the federal government. Other powers belong to just the state or local governments. For instance, conducting elections. When you go to vote, when you turn 18, you go to vote, the states conduct their own elections. So the federal government doesn't come in and tell South Carolina how to run its elections. South Carolina runs its elections, and Florida runs its elections, and Wyoming runs its elections. Education systems. Now, the federal government does have a role, but this is a job of the state and local government. So if you look at, for instance, if you go to S.E. Whitmore School, that is a state charter school. That's not a federal school, it's a state school. You even have local, think about most schools are local schools, like Lexington 1. I used to teach in Lexington 1. That's a local government school system. So the federal government doesn't really involve itself in education systems. Setting up local governments is a power that just belongs to the states. South Carolina gets to decide how it's going to set up its local governments. we decided we're going to set up counties. And so we have counties in South Carolina, and we have cities or towns or municipalities in South Carolina. An example of counties would be Richland, Lexington, Spartanburg, Charleston, Dorchester, Horry. I mean, there are 46 of them. And then what we have are some powers that are shared. These are called concurrent powers, but they're shared between the two. Things like taxes. Both South Carolina and the federal government can tax us. Roads. Both South Carolina and the federal government can build roads. Borrowing money. Both South Carolina and the federal government can borrow money. So these are things that are shared between the two. These are shared powers. And you can see there in the chart, there are some specific ones listed. The red would be just the federal government powers. The blue would be just the state government powers. And then the purple would be those shared or concurrent powers. Okay, so what happens when there's a conflict? What happens when state and the federal government conflict over issues? Well, that's happened in our history. For the most part, the federal government wins those conflicts, but not always, not always. And a lot of times the courts have to get involved, and the courts have to decide who wins on the issue. Is it the state governments or is it the federal government? An example from our history where the courts did not get involved, but where we saw an actual violent conflict was the Civil War. The Civil War was a war fought over who's going to have power over slavery, who's going to have more power, the federal government or the state governments. And in the end, we know that the federal government won. The North, representing the federal government, won the war, and because of that, the federal government has more power than the state governments. Gay marriage is a modern example of this. Gay marriage used to be illegal in the majority, used to be illegal in every state, but even as of 6 years ago, it was illegal in most of our states. Most states in America, gay marriage was not a legal thing. Today, it is legal in all 50 states. The reason is the Supreme Court ruled in a landmark decision that that was a constitutional right, that marriage was a constitutional right, and that you could not discriminate based on whether a person was straight or gay. And so gay marriage is now legal in all 50 states. In other words, that was a situation where the federal government overruled the states and won. There are other issues where the states have won, like marijuana as an example. You have some states that have made marijuana legal in their state, even though federally it's illegal. And the courts and the federal government have granted the states that right to do that. And so we've seen the states win on some of these issues too. For the most part, though, the federal government does win. All right, there are two different types of federalism. We have what's called cooperative federalism, and we have what's called dual federalism. Cooperative federalism is also called marble cake federalism because the powers of the two mix together. They work together and they mix together to solve common problems. This was the type of federalism we really saw prior to the Civil War in America, where the states and the federal government really worked together to work through problems, and it wasn't clear that there were different layers. Dual federalism is the opposite of that. It's where there are clear layers where the federal government has some power, the states have their power, and the local governments have their power, and you don't intervene in each other's power. We sort of in America, we've had both of these. We have some areas that are cooperative and some areas where we would say we have dual federalism. All right, so how does the federal government get states to do things it doesn't necessarily want to do? A lot of this is through money. So we have things called grants, and so the federal government will give grants to states, basically forcing them to do certain things if they're given the money. Now, there are different types of grants. A grant in aid is very, very exclusive, and it means that money is given for a specific project. So for instance, this didn't happen, but let's just pretend that the federal government wanted to build a bridge between separating the Columbia and West Columbia, where we have the river there, and so they gave South Carolina money to build that bridge, and the only thing that money could be used for was building that bridge. That is a specific project, so South Carolina wouldn't even have a say over that. They would simply take the money and build the bridge. Other grants are a little looser, but not very much looser. Those are called categorical grants. Those are money given for a specific purpose. It's not a specific project, but would be a specific purpose. For instance, the federal government gives South Carolina money to rebuild after a natural disaster, after, let's say, a hurricane. And so it says you're going to rebuild your bridges and roads after the hurricane. It's not a specific bridge, it's not a specific road, but you can't, South Carolina couldn't use that money for education. They would have to use that money to build roads and bridges that were damaged by the hurricane. The third level of grants are called block or general grants. These grants are where there's a lot of discretion. So the federal government would give South Carolina money to spend it basically how they'd want to spend it. These are rare today. We don't see very many block or general grants given to the states anymore because the federal government does like to force the states to do what they want them to do. But there are general grants out there. There are block grants out there where states do get to decide how they're going to spend that money. This would be federal government money given to states, and the states would then decide how to spend it. Then you have the fourth kind is called unfunded mandates. These are things that states are forced to abide by, certain rules that they're given by the federal government, and they tell the states, you've got to abide by these rules and regulations, but they don't give them any money to do so. So an example of that would be like the No Child Left Behind policy in education. They had these policies that they put down on the states, but they didn't give the states any money to then go and enact these policies, to enact this state level testing or whatever it is that they're forcing the states to do. States hate unfunded mandates. The federal government loves to give down unfunded mandates. The states hate to get them because then they're spending their money on something they didn't even decide on, something they didn't even have a say in. They're just forced to do it. Okay. If you have any questions about anything to do with federalism, feel free to make an appointment. Feel free to come see me during office hours. Feel free to ask me a question in a teacher message. Certainly, I'm here to help you. If you're watching this in Ms. Lekovich's class, you can ask her about this as well. But we're here to help you with any of this. This was a pretty short video, so hopefully it will help you answer the questions in the lesson. And we'll see you next time, guys.